So I became interested. So since law school, I was part of a student movement. I was part of the student union there, and something that really bothered me was the disconnection between academia, academic knowledge, and what's happening on the ground. So for me, it was really important to connect the knowledge that was acquired within academic space and what was happening in society, because those two things, they are so entangled. And I think that that when I decided to pursue an academic career, I was already engaged in social movements. I was already engaged in the feminist movement. And in that sense, my research questions, they really come organically from the issues that I encounter on the ground. So it's not that I am a researcher that is sitting in my office and then I think to myself, well, I need a new research topic. Let me see what's happening out there. But it's quite the opposite. I'm already engaged in the struggles that are happening, particularly among the feminist movement. And that's from there that those research questions, they come to me. So I think it's really a way of seeing that knowledge production is an integral, it's such an important part of the making of the word. And as Beata just mentioned, like I want to live and build and be a more just word. And I can do so by producing knowledge that is socially relevant and that speaks to people's needs and to people's necessities. I really think that if your research is informed by feminist theory, there is no way also to disconnect what you do from what is happening on the ground, because this idea, like the premise is that theory and practice, they are deeply interconnected and you cannot disentangle them. And I think so if you are true to feminist epistemology, that's the way that you are going to approach your subject and the research that you do. Well, in my case, I think also giving examples is a good way to show it. So the last like largest piece of research I did was my PhD. And there I was basically interested in legal discourses around women's human rights. So I was interested in the production of this legal category, women's human rights. So rather than actually engaging with feminist activists on the ground, I was interested in looking at the writings of feminist legal scholars and how they have developed that category and how the category was being used by an international human rights court, which was the Inter-American Human Rights Courts. So I wasn't really doing anything very different or deconstructive in terms of methodology, but rather just doing discourse analysis of documents and writings and legal writings. And then most recently, and this has been a challenge, I'm trying to understand what role law plays and what are the conceptions of law that activists for what we have been calling self-managed abortion, which is activists that provide access to pills and access to information outside of the medical system. And what is the role of law in their activism? How do they engage with the law? If they are producing, that's my argument, I think they are producing a new legal framework which challenges states' legal framework. But when I started that research, it was a few months before the pandemic. So I had plans of going to all these meetings and meeting these activists and interview them and talk to them. And so far, the pandemic hit, everything, like we are not able to travel anymore for a while. So what I have been doing is participating in a lot of virtual events. and doing what I would say like a somewhat like an online ethnography of different events that are taking place in different parts of the world, but everything online. And I also participate in mailing lists and discussions and yeah, like a group apps, like conversation, like in chat groups. And then now that I am getting more acquainted with different groups, I'm going to start to scheduling interview with specific people. But doing this during a pandemic has been a challenge because I think, and I don't know if Beata agrees with me, but I think that the interaction, like the personal interaction with the persons, is so important in order to get their data and to establish like a relationship of trust. Because I think one of the things that is quite important in the topics that we study is that these are very politically charged issues that also carry some risk for activists. So one of the things that I'm always questioning myself is like, what are the consequences of the publications that I'm putting out in the world? What are the data that I'm revealing? Is this data going to be used against activists? Is this going to do some harm? It's going to put people in danger. And I think those are ethical questions that other researchers sometimes they don't really do, right? Like they are guided by this idea that research ethics, as long as the person gave you consent, you are allowed then to do your publication. And I think that when it comes to feminist scholars, we are also worried about what kinds of harms and dangers our research can put people in. So I think that for the case of Brazil, one thing that is really clear is that feminists and women and LGBTQ communities, they have been at the forefront of political struggles throughout the history of the country. So if we think in the redemocratization after the military dictatorship, so we had a really long military dictatorship for over 2 decades, which ended in the 1980s. And feminists and women activists and LGBTQ communities, which at that point were much more invisible than the feminist struggle itself, they were at the forefront of the struggle and the demands for redemocratization. But something that always happens is that they are told, well, you know, those issues are particular issues. Those issues are really like just your issues. We first need to have democracy, and then we can talk about women's rights, then we can talk about LGBTQ rights, and so on and so forth. So it's also almost like, okay, those questions. And I think here in Brazil, something that's super important also to mention is the Black women's movement, and just like the Black movement in general, because again, just with misogyny, anti-gender discourse, also racism is something that is politically avoided throughout history, right? So it's like, okay, when we have democracy back, we can talk about sexuality issues, we can talk about gender, we can discuss the problem of racism, but let's get democracy first. And I think that with this current government, what we are seeing is precisely that this right-wing government has made anti-gender, and then when I mention gender, it's about the entire spectrum, right? It's about women's rights, but also about LGBTQI rights. So it has made gender such center to its agenda that even those who want to avoid talking and engaging with gender politically cannot, because if you want to defeat this government, then you need to defeat their anti-gender agenda. This is really central for them. And it has become even more central right now when the government has failed to deliver all the other promises. So it has failed to deliver economic prosperity. It has failed to deliver security. And so now the only thing that they have is really this battle, this moral battle against gender, what they call gender ideology. So I think that's why it has become such a central issue, perhaps not so much because other parts of the left and progressive movements, they have finally realized that gender, but they have been put in a position where they need to engage with it. Otherwise, you cannot move on, because this is such a central agenda that has really brought this right-wing government to power. Yeah, so for me, I haven't faced anything personally, and I think I have been very fortunate in the circles that I have been, and the scholars and colleagues that I have interacted with, but I can see there is still so something that Beata was talking about the creation of the gender studies programs, and it establishing as a subfield itself, an interdisciplinary subfield. So this happened in Brazil I think, quite fastly. I really think that what I want to accomplish with my research is making visible issues, questions, needs, and people who usually are do not figure within in knowledge production, right? So it's like this idea, which is like there are certain issues, either because it's hard to get to them, and I think this is like something important, like the kind of connections that we have as activists allows us to access spaces and peoples and issues that usually other researchers would not have access to. And I think it's important to make visible the knowledge that they are producing, the discussions they are having, the questions they are posing to society. So I think this is one. And the other one, I think it's almost like being some sort of an example for students who are being formed.